Wednesday Bible study on the book of Exodus. Now, last week we kind of finished up the 10 plagues, at least sort of. I mean, that's kind of how I'm at least labeling the videos. Technically, in Exodus chapter 12, that's where we see the final plague. So, and that's what we're going to be in this video is Exodus chapter 12. But, more importantly than this being the 10th plague is this is the celebration of the Passover festival. I mean, whenever you start to think about what the book of Exodus is known for. I mean, it's known for a few things. I mean, the whole name of the book is Exodus. It has to do with exiting out of the land of Egypt and going toward the promised land. So one of those things, of course, is the crossing of the Red Sea. We're going to get to that in a couple more chapters. But definitely one big chapter in this is chapter 12, where we see the Passover celebration. And one of the things about the Passover is I guess this is kind of one of the biggest things from the book of Exodus that carries over and still has like direct connection and direct meaning to the things that we celebrate as Christians. Because we're going to be reading about the Passover, the festival, the Passover meal that they would participate in. And at this time, when you fast forward a few hundred years, actually a little bit more than 1,000 years, you come to Jesus Christ in the New Testament. And whenever Jesus Christ comes into the New Testament, we find that just before he was crucified, that he shared a Passover meal with his disciples. We call that the Last Supper. I mean, that was the Last Supper that he had, but now we partake of a similar meal to that one. We call it the Lord's Supper. So there's several key things. Of course, there's going to be some differences, but there's several key things about this Passover chapter that deal with Jesus Christ. The night that he was crucified and that meal that we still participate in on a weekly basis that we call communion today, or the Lord's Supper. And that is kind of the modern day version of what the Passover was to Israel. And some of the same reasons as to why we see the significance of the Passover meal in the Old Testament is carried over in some ways into the New Testament. So we might kind of touch on those a little bit as we go throughout this chapter. So let's dive in here together in Exodus chapter 12. Verses 1 through 11. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month is to be your beginning of months. It will be your first month of the year. Tell the whole community of Israel, in the 10th day of this month, they each must take a lamb for themselves according to their families, a lamb for each household. If any household is too small for a lamb, the man and his next door neighbor are to take a lamb according to the number of people. You will make your count for the lamb according to how much each one can eat. Your lamb must be perfect, a male, 1 year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You must care for it until the 14th day of this month. Then the whole community of Israel will kill it around sundown. They will take some of the blood and put it on the two side posts and on top of the doorframe of the houses where they will eat it. They will eat the meat the same night. They will eat it roasted over the fire with bread made without yeast and with bitter herbs. Do not eat it raw or boiled in water, but roast it over the fire with its head, its legs, and its entrails. You must leave nothing until morning, but you must burn with fire whatever remains of it until morning. This is how you are to eat it. Dressed to travel, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand. You are to eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover." Okay, so now I know that's kind of a small font on this slide here, but there's a lot in these 11 verses as you start this chapter. So the previous chapter, Moses was being told by God that this final plague is going to be death of the firstborn. And the reason for the death of the firstborn is Pharaoh mocked the firstborn of God, so to speak, with the children of Israel. So now what God kind of does in a sense of a final punishment was that he was going to bring death to Egypt because of their harshness and just how they were just being unjust to the people of Israel. And what he did was he brought death to the firstborn. But now Moses was told these things that on this night they were going to have this special meal together, this Passover meal. And there's so much about this meal because we see that about the lamb being the sacrifice here. And actually, I guess I'm kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself. So let's back up and let's see some of these significant features. One of them comes in verse 2. In verse 2, we see that God says this month is to be your beginning of months. It's supposed to be this first of the month. So something new is happening. Something big is happening. So much so that it's going to affect kind of their calendar, so to speak. And that kind of makes sense because as we turn the pages, kind of making some parallels. I guess I'll make some parallels now to the New Testament here. Like when John starts his gospel, he starts it the same way the book of Genesis does. Genesis starts the whole story of the Bible in the beginning. Well, John, whenever he starts his gospel, this new beginning through Jesus Christ, he starts it off with the same words, in the beginning. So there is this new beginning, and that new beginning is actually starting right here in Exodus 12, because that's why this is supposed to be like the first month out of their year. Okay, so that's one thing that we see. There's a new beginning, and that's a parallel to the Christian community that we're going to read about in the New Testament, of course, years later after this occasion here. Then in verse 5, we find out about this lamb that is going to be sacrificed, this lamb that is going to be really kind of a main part of the meal. This lamb was to be perfect. And by the way, another parallel to John's gospel here in the New Testament, when John the Baptist sees Jesus, he says, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." So he compares Jesus Christ to God's Lamb. And really, Jesus is also compared to the Passover lamb. We're not going to get into a whole lot of those things. I'm just going to kind of make some of these parallels here. There's several passages that we could look at, but we're not going to really look at that too much because Exodus 12 is kind of, it's a long enough chapter just by itself. So let's kind of focus on this, but I'll make some of these parallels as we go. But this lamb was to be a perfect lamb. No problem, nothing to be wrong with it at all. And that's exactly the type of sacrifice that Jesus was. We also find out in verse 6 that the whole community is to be involved in this. And this is important, to recognize that the whole community was to be involved in this meal and in this whole kind of ceremony, the whole ritual that goes along with this. And the blood was to go around the door frame, and whenever they were, so to speak, whenever the door of their house was covered in blood, whenever it was surrounded by blood, the death was going to pass over their house. In a similar type fashion, whenever we are Christians and whenever we have the blood of Jesus covering us, then death is not going to have its hold on us. It's going to pass over us, so to speak. Not physical death here for us. Spiritual death is what I'm talking about. We also see another thing that I find interesting in verse 11, that they are to dress like they're ready to travel. Now, okay, the reason for this, we're going to notice this as we keep reading in this chapter. The reason for this is they're going to travel, okay? Makes perfect sense. But there is a parallel for us as Christians, and that is that we need to be really on a daily basis. We need to be ready for travel, so to speak. We need to be ready to follow wherever God is leading us. And just like they needed to be ready to travel and to go wherever God was going to be leading them. And I can't help but think about there's some parallels, whenever we partake of the Lord's Supper today, that we need to be ready to travel, so to speak, ready to get out of the land of slavery and into the promised land. Okay, so there's much more to this chapter, so let's continue moving right along. Verses 12 through 15 now. I will pass through the land of Egypt in the same night, and I will attack all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both of humans and of animals. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, so that when I see the blood I will pass over you, and this plague will not fall on you to destroy you when I attack the land of Egypt. This day will become a memorial for you, and you will celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. You will celebrate it perpetually as a lasting ordinance. For 7 days you must eat bread made without yeast. Surely on the first day you must put away yeast from your houses, because anyone who eats bread made with yeast from the first day to the seventh day will be cut off from Israel. So in this passage we get a little bit more about this Passover festival, this Passover feast, this Passover memorial. It's called a few different things. But here, along the same lines, keep in mind this is still the 10th plague that's coming through. And whenever he talks about this plague, he does mention something very interesting to me in verse 12. He talks about that this judgment and that this that's going to be coming on is not just on the people, it's not just on the humans, not just on the animals, but it says, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. It's very interesting that he talks about that. In fact, I don't really remember if I got too much into this, but each of the 10 plagues, I have seen different charts and stuff like that will kind of relate each one of the 10 plagues and shows how that specifically attacks one of the gods that they worshipped in the land of Egypt. Now, these aren't, these gods, they're not the Lord God, the God of the Bible that we read about. They're the different gods that they worshipped. We see one of those, if you remember, actually later on, just after they exit out of the land of Egypt, they start worshiping the golden calf. Remember? Well, that golden calf, that was one of the gods of Egypt that the people worshipped. So it's not by accident that they just kind of formed some calf and they did that. There was a reason behind all those things. And the gods of Egypt, they had so many different gods in which they worshipped, the gods for all different types of things. And here, what our God is saying is that He's going to pronounce judgment upon these gods of Egypt. And whenever you look at that, I think it's very interesting that you see those parallels between the 10 plagues there. And those 10 plagues, I don't know. Maybe this is just me that I haven't done enough study myself to see if there's kind of a 1-to-1 ratio about how each one of the plagues matches up with a particular god of Egypt. I don't know if it's exactly that precise, but what God is doing with those plagues is He's showing them that the gods of Egypt are not the ones who are in control. There is only one God who is ultimately in control, and that is the Lord our God. And He reveals Himself to Moses in this book, and He is the one who is guiding His people out of the land of Egypt right here. So all these things, and that's kind of it is interesting that he mentions the reason for why he's doing this again. So we really have looked at several reasons why the 10 plagues have come, but they did come as this judgment. But here, in connection with this judgment, what we also see is that there's this memorial festival, this memorial feast that they are to celebrate, called the Passover of the Lord. And this Passover is something that they're going to remember in years to come. And it's very particular about how they do it and everything. And it's also connected with the unleavened bread. That was what they would eat at this time. That's also why whenever we take a communion, it's something that looks kind of like a cracker type thing. It's unleavened bread is what that is. Or maybe now, we're kind of used to these prepackaged cups that have a little bit of a flap that has that small wafer of bread. And that's an unleavened bread is what that is. It's really flat. And one of the reasons why they did it here for the Passover, and we will see this as we keep reading, but one of the reasons for that unleavened bread during the Passover is because they needed to have this meal quickly and ready to go. And if you wait for the bread to rise, that takes time, and it takes a bit more to do those things. Unleavened bread is a much quicker type of a meal to get ready and to be able to eat it. Now let's look at verses 16 through 20. On the first day there will be a holy convocation, and on the seventh day there will be a holy convocation for you. You must do no work of any kind on them, only what every person will eat, that alone may be prepared for you. So you will keep the feast of unleavened bread, because on this very day I brought your regiments out of the land of Egypt, and so you must keep this day perpetually as a lasting ordinance. In the first month, from the 14th day of the month in the evening, you will eat bread made without yeast until the 21st day of the month in the evening. For 7 days yeast must not be found in your houses. For whoever eats what is made with yeast, that person will be cut off from the community of Israel, whether a resident foreigner or one born in the land. You will not eat anything made with yeast. In all the places where you live, you must eat bread made without yeast. Okay, so if you want some more details, there you are. There's a few more details about this. It's just kind of continuing that on and mentioning that this Feast of Unleavened Bread, it's going to be more than just kind of a one-day celebration. Sometimes we sort of combine this Feast of Unleavened Bread with the Passover, and yes, there is this connection. There's a really close connection here. But all of it was to be a memorial. They were supposed to be reminded of what God did during this time. And I think it's important that whenever we take of communion together, that we recognize that it has the history of coming from the Passover. Obviously, the meaning of it is a little different. This meaning was to remind them, the Passover meaning is to remind them of what the Lord did on this night that we're reading about here in Exodus 12. And of course, whenever we partake of the Lord's Supper, the meaning goes back to what our Lord Jesus did. Now, He was our Passover lamb, and that sacrifice and all is still important to us. It's still important for us to remember that and to have a lasting memorial for today as well. Verses 21 through 28 now. Then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and told them, "Go and select for yourselves a lamb or young goat for your families and kill the Passover animals. Take a branch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin and apply to the top of the doorframe and the two side posts some of the blood that is in the basin. Not one of you is to go out of the door of his house until morning, for the Lord will pass through to strike Egypt, and when he sees the blood on the top of the doorframe and the two side posts, then the Lord will pass over the door, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you. You must observe this event as an ordinance for you and for your children forever. When you enter the land that the Lord will give to you, just as he said, you must observe the ceremony. When your children ask you, 'What does this ceremony mean to you?' then you must say, 'It is a sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, when he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt, when he struck Egypt and delivered our households.' The people bowed down low to the ground, and the Israelites went away and did exactly as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron." Okay, more information. Basically, it just kind of once again tells us this is something that they were supposed to do, and it's supposed to be this ordinance that they do. It's not just for them. It's something that they observe every single year, but it's also for their children forever. Verse 24 says that. Then we get this interesting um, kind of ritual, I guess, if you want to call it ceremony, if you will, in verses 26 and 27 that was connected to the Passover, feast. And that is when your children ask you, "What does this ceremony mean to you?" By the way, we need to be thinking about this. Those of you who are listening, who have children, without a doubt, at some point, your kids are going to ask you, "What does this mean to you?" Maybe that might be whenever we do take of communion today. Your kids might ask you, "What does this ceremony mean to you?" I must admit that whenever I had kids, I didn't realize that those questions were going to come as early as they did. But my son, I mean, he was most certainly asking questions about the Lord's Supper and what that all was about. I mean, he was asking questions. I mean, probably whenever he was 3, maybe even 2 years old. It's much younger than I was expecting for children to start wondering, why do we do this? What is going on? So this right here, this was part of what they did at the Passover night, is that the children would ask, what does this mean? What's the meaning of all this that we do? Well, in verse 27, for the Passover, then you will say, "It is a sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, when he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt, when he struck Egypt and delivered our households." Can't we give kind of a similar response whenever our children ask us, "What does the ceremony of the Lord's Supper mean to us?" Well, it still does remind us of the Lord's Passover. And it does remind us of how the Lord did lead the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, out of that land of slavery and into the promised land. But for us, what it also represents is that Jesus is our Passover lamb. And it also represents that sacrifice that he gave for us. Of course, it represents the body and the blood of Jesus, but also even more than that. That represents how Jesus allowed us to go from the land of slavery, so to speak, and into freedom. And that all happens in Jesus Christ and in his sacrifice. So yes, children will ask questions. We need to be ready to give the answer to these questions because they will come. And we need to be prepared. We need to know what the reasons are for why we do these things that we do whenever we gather together. Now verses 29 through 32. Now we're actually going to see, all this was was what they needed to do. Now we're going to see it actually happening. Verse 29 through 32. It happened at midnight. The Lord attacked all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the prison, and all the firstborn of the cattle. Pharaoh got up in the night, along with all his servants and all Egypt, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no house in which there was not someone dead. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, "Get up, get out from among my people, both you and the Israelites. Go, serve the Lord as you have requested. Also take your flocks and your herds, just as you have requested, and leave. But bless me also." This was it. Pharaoh has had enough. This has just really crushed Egypt. You look at this, and this was just kind of this final crushing blow. He was ready to just get him out of there. He was done with it. Of course he was upset because his own family had been touched by this. In fact, there was no house, what it says in verse 30, there was no house in Egypt in which someone didn't die because they weren't part of this Passover festival. The destroyer, so to speak, as was mentioned in the last slide there, the destroyer visited each one of those houses. And it was such a big deal that Pharaoh got up in the middle of the night, and other people got up in the middle of the night. And Pharaoh also summoned Moses and Aaron in the night, and he had this conversation and just told them to get out. And he also said that final statement, "But bless me also." It's kind of interesting that if you notice that Pharaoh has requested prayers or different things like that, but he's never really been truly repentant. And I'm not so sure that you see him even repentant right here. He's still just asking. He sort of just seems to be asking for just a little bit of mercy, that they would just leave and nothing else bad happen, and that he just hopes it. And this time, we also see in verse 32 that now he's done making deals. Before he was like, okay, you can go, but you got to leave these people back, or this group of people back behind, so that way you'll come back. And then, well, you can go, but you got to leave your animals behind. Then finally, now he just says, go. Everybody, everything, go. He's done with it. But there's still more. Verses 33 through 36. The Egyptians were urging the people on in order to send them out of the land quickly, for they were saying, "We are all dead." So the people took their dough before the yeast was added, with their kneading troughs bound up in their clothing and on their shoulders. Now the Israelites had done as Moses told them. They had requested from the Egyptians silver and gold items and clothing. The Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and they gave them whatever they wanted, and so they plundered Egypt. See, even the people are recognizing how hard it is. This is not the first time that the people of Egypt have stepped in and have recognized, look, this is really affecting us. Something's got to be done. And then they just send them away. And apparently the children of Israel, they did find favor because of what the Lord did. And they plundered Egypt in this way. It's kind of an interesting story that we oftentimes sort of overlook, I guess, and maybe we don't really think about the significance of this. But this is how they left Egypt in a very interesting way. And let's keep reading now, because this is actually part of their journey. So now we're starting to get into when they actually start to leave the land of Egypt. It happens right here in Exodus chapter 12, around these verses here that we're looking at. Verses 37 through 42 now. The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, plus their dependents. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and flocks and herds, a very large number of cattle. They baked cakes of bread without yeast, using the dough they had brought from Egypt. For it was made without yeast, because they were thrust out of Egypt and were not able to delay. They could not prepare food for themselves either. Now the length of the time the Israelites lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, on the very day, all the regiments of the Lord went out of the land of Egypt. It was a night of vigil for the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. And so on this night, all Israel is to keep a vigil to the Lord for generations to come. So we find out a little bit more about this yeast. We find out that they're starting to eat this bread, and this is how they are kind of partaking of this bread is kind of along their journey as they are starting to travel out, because everything had to be done quickly. And we see that they had this evening celebration, this evening vigil, as it's translated here, to remember what the Lord did, and it was supposed to be for generations to come. And of course, even today, there's still this remembrance around the Passover time, at least among people who hold this very very dear. They are still continuing this on, and to remember of what God did at this time during this Passover time. Verses 43 through the end of the chapter now, so 43 to 51. I told you it was a long chapter. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner may share in eating it, but everyone's servants who is bought for money, after you have circumcised him, may eat it. A foreigner and a hired worker must not eat it. It must be eaten in one house. You must not bring any of the meat outside of the house, and you must not break a bone of it. The whole community of Israel must observe it. When a resident foreigner lives with you and wants to observe the Passover to the Lord, all his males must be circumcised, and then he may approach and observe it. And he will be like one who is born in the land, but no uncircumcised person may eat of it. The same law will apply to the person who is native born and to the resident foreigner who lives among you." So all the Israelites did exactly as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, and on this very day the Lord brought the Israelites out of the land of Egypt by their regiments. Okay, so here at the end of this chapter, we find out a few things about it. Once again, verse 47, this whole community is observing this thing. We also find out something in verses 48, and I guess it's all just verse 48. That's a really long verse. There in verse 48, it talks about how all of the males have to be circumcised, and in fact it ends with, but no uncircumcised person may eat of it. You remember I kind of mentioned this earlier on, back in Exodus chapter 4, when we have that weird story that apparently Moses is going back to the land of Egypt. And as he's going there, apparently he had not circumcised his son for whatever reason. I don't know why. But he was there. He hadn't circumcised his son. And then Zipporah, his wife, circumcises his son. And they kind of make this big deal about it that he needed to be circumcised. And the Lord was about to strike Moses right there, all the way in Exodus 4. Well, if his son had not been circumcised then his son would not have gotten to participate now, during this time, for the Passover. So, I mean, it would be very, very important, of course, if your leader is going to abide by the law and is going to make sure that his own family, all the males of his household, are circumcised. Once again, it's a weird story in Exodus 4, but we see the importance was that it was a sign of the covenant. That's what the descendants of Abraham were supposed to do, to remember about what God did and that covenant that he made with Abraham. And now we see that there's still supposed to be more about this remembrance here. And that comes through this Passover celebration. And yeah, it was very particular about who could celebrate it and what you had to do. And then we find out in verse 50, so all the Israelites did exactly as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. I wish that we could look right here and to say, isn't this a wonderful story? That they were so faithful to God, they're delivered from the land of Egypt, and everything is going great for them. It does kind of look that way. But as we will continue, we will see that, yeah, they did exactly what the Lord commanded right here. But they are still human. And a few chapters later, they're still doing their own thing. They're not doing what the Lord commanded, just a few chapters after this. But right now, we definitely see this wonderful image. And, if you could kind of end the story right here, you could almost end it with a happily ever after type ending. But we do find this is a highlight of the book. I mean, this is a really big deal, because this is that the Lord is bringing them out of the land of Egypt. Now, they're not fully out of the land of Egypt yet. That's going to happen later. And they're also not done with that. Remember, the Red Sea crossing hasn't happened. But they're starting on their journey. And they're going in the right direction at this point. And this is where we're going to have to end, and we'll pick back up next week with the rest of this story, or at least continue this story of the book of Exodus.